Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. I am Jojo19 and today I've got a pretty big one for you all. We're going to be covering three topics, as of course I haven't uploaded a video in a while. It's been fairly uneventful over the last few weeks, but today we finally have something to talk about. So, I'm going to be covering three topics. Originally I had planned to do three separate videos for these three topics, but I decided to delay the process by 2 days in order to get them out in one big bunch. So if you're interested in any particular piece, I'll leave timestamps up on the video and you can go and look at it. For those wondering, today we're going to be covering the third Republican presidential debate, the 2023 United States elections, and the United States-Australian summit and ongoing relations. And with that, I'd like to begin with the third Republican presidential debate. So, a lot has happened since the second. There have been a number of developments that have happened since the last debate. We can now see that the total number of candidates has been reduced to 5. Chris Christie, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Tim Scott. Doug Burnham is gone. Mike Pence is gone. Burnham's campaign is yet to concede, but I do believe they'll be suspending their campaign within some time, whereas Mike Pence suspended his campaign last month. So, how did this happen? Why did Mike Pence, who was originally a frontrunner to an extent, lose his credibility? Well, as I spoke about in the first two videos, I never really saw Mike Pence as someone who could fill the position of the nominee or really excite people in the debates, but also in the campaign itself. I didn't see him as anyone other than someone to appeal to a very particular sect of the Republican Party, one that could generally support any one of these candidates, and as such, I didn't think he'd get that far. It's the same with Doug Burnham, although the case was a little bit more promising because he was just a slightly younger, and I think his campaign was also more focused than Pence. Nonetheless, they're both gone, and they will no longer be partaking in the debates or likely the campaign. So, I'm going to be talking about each one of these candidates, and particularly who I think won, and I have a definitive answer for you today, and also who lost. So there were a number of topics that were discussed at the debate. One of the most prudent was the Israel and Palestine conflict. The candidates spoke particularly about what's going on the domestic front and how college, universities and campuses are responding to the crisis, particularly in regards to which demographics are supporting which side and how that plays out in the Republican Party. For those of you who didn't see my video on Israel and the Gaza conflict and how the Republican and Democratic Party react, generally speaking, the Republican Party supports Israel and its right to defend itself, and the Democratic Party supports a ceasefire, and there are various members of the left wing that support Palestine. So generally all of these candidates, every single candidate is going to be supporting Israel. And all of them did. There was no surprise there. What was interesting is how they reacted and responded to the specificality of how they should be supported. Some candidates said that they should support them and arm themselves in the similar manner that they would support Ukraine arming themselves and fighting their own war on the front against Russia. And some of them said we need to be sending financial and military aid to Israel to destroy Hamas. I think the most successful argument that was made, and I won't talk about who promoted it yet, but I will say I think that the most successful argument that was made, so the statement that will appeal to most Republicans, is the argument that Israel should be given the support to defend itself, but they should also understand that it is their responsibility to defend themselves while the United States invests in securing its southern border. The reason that I think that is a successful argument is because it kills two birds with one stone, basically. What it does is it reaffirms America's support to Israel. It also states that Israel and foreign entities that are allies of the United States should be expected to defend themselves, and that the United States shouldn't be required to send money or to send military aid, either in manpower or in equipment, to other countries. And it also, I suppose, kill three birds with one stone, it also promotes the idea of border security, which is a fundamental aspect of Republican politics these days. So I think that argument is going to really appeal to broad conservatives and people who support Israel across the nation. The other arguments that were made in regards to this was that of college students and the idea that any group that aligns themselves with or makes supporting statements and comments towards Hamas should be disbanded, or if they are being supported by college students on a visa or by universities with federal funding, the funding should be rescinded and the visas should expire. That was the claim that was made by several candidates, and the argument was generally that both factors were a privilege and not a right. I think that is something, maybe it's a little bit hawkish, but generally speaking, I think that the Republican Party is going to support that, and members of the Republican Party will see that as a strong domestic and foreign policy. So I won't go too much more into the details of So I won't go too far into the contents of the debate itself from there. I just wanted to speak broadly about what had happened with Israel and Gaza, because there have also been some developments since it's begun, and I wanted to tell you how the Republican Party is reacting to that. There was also a discussion on TikTok, and people generally stuck to their guns in regards to the messaging there, though I will say there is generally a more broad appeal to banning TikTok outright across the country, not just on government devices, than there was previously. And I think that is the result of the Montana governor, and I think that has set a precedent that it can happen. So, from there, I'd like to talk about the candidates themselves. Who won, who lost. Who lost, who won. The first person I'm going to speak of is Tim Scott. Ripping the band-aid off, get him out of the way, I don't see why Tim Scott is still in this race. He was always in a similar position to that of Doug Burnham and Mike Pence. He's a bit of a household name. Some people will know him, South Carolinians will know him, but also understand that South Carolinians know Nikki Haley, and generally she's more broadly appealing and renowned. People know her better. South Carolinians know her better. She was the governor of South Carolina, so the statewide appeal doesn't really stick with Tim Scott. His articulation, his general demeanor is not one that stands out as particularly exciting, unlike Vivek Ramaswamy or Haley, and I think that is a real letdown to his campaign, considering that his policies are generally mainstream and could actually toe the line to get him the nomination. If he was just able to resonate more with the voter, then he may be able to translate his support for these policies better. But generally speaking, he's a conservative, but he doesn't really fight like a hawk or a populist like Donald Trump, and he doesn't really stick to a clear, concise, state-based or pragmatic approach which focuses on the success of individual policy like DeSantis. I mean, every time, especially in this debate, you heard DeSantis go off about his record in Florida. I wouldn't be surprised if this was Tim Scott's last debate, but I would say to keep an eye on him, particularly for a position in Trump's campaign, perhaps as the vice president, perhaps as a secretary or as a member of his cabinet. But I would have to call Tim Scott as the definitive loser of this campaign and of this debate. The next candidate I'd like to talk about is Chris Christie, and it's a similar situation. It's the third debate, And while I understand that his campaign is one that is particularly hingent on a very specific demographic, I generally think his time is up. Particularly his age is a concern, considering that Trump and Biden's age are already the forefront of a lot of discussion. I think that Chris Christie's moderate populism has been faded into a kind of compassionate conservatism, not necessarily dissimilar from that which George W. Bush promoted 23 years ago in 2000 in his first presidential election. So I think, although a lot of people admire him, I think his campaign is generally over at this point, and it's lost a lot of traction that it had at the beginning of the year and earlier on, in a few months ago. I wouldn't call him a loser of this debate so much as I would particularly irrelevant. So I think that this could be his last or second last debate, depending on how his campaign goes and his fundraising goes over the next few months. The next candidate I'd like to talk about is Ron DeSantis, and I spoke about it in the previous video on the second debate, but I generally think he's picked it up a bit. I think when his campaign began, it had promise. Its decline occurred when it started, and when it officially started, I think he took too many risks, but then played it far too safe. He ended up alienating a lot of the base that supported him in the first place, which was to say he focused on social conservatism. But now I see him kind of attacking Trump a little bit more, focusing more so on his policy record, on foreign policy, and that of his economic position. So for that reason, I think his campaign has picked up a little bit of traction, and I definitely think he'll remain around for the next few debates. I wouldn't call him a winner, but I would call him probably the most presidential out of any candidate here tonight, bar Tim Scott, who just felt a little bit in-focused. Ron DeSantis was able to stick usually to answering the question and to being able to stray away from petty arguments, which brings me to the big guys, Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley. I'm going to talk about them as a group, as a pair, because frankly, I think these are the main reason that people still watch these debates, is the bickering and the fervent conflict between these two that spiraled out of control in this debate. It involved Nikki Haley's daughter, and it involved her position on Chinese investment into South Carolina. It involved allegations of hypocrisy on foreign policy, on the United Nations. But to sum it up, what it is these two profit far more off of bouncing off each other than they ever would sticking to someone's guns, sticking to answering the question and talking about the specificality of policy like you might see Tim Scott or Ron DeSantis do. Because what happens is if Vivek Ramaswamy takes a snag at Nikki Haley will bite back, and she did on numerous occasions in this debate. She talked about how her heels, Vivek Ramaswamy called her Dick Cheney in high heels. She bit back and said that they were full of ammunition. Vivek Ramaswamy said that claimed that there was hypocrisy in regards to TikTok, and that Nikki Haley supported banning TikTok, and yet her own daughter was on TikTok. And then Nikki Haley bit back and said, keep your daughter out of your mouth. Personally, I think a much better comeback would have been to say, why are you looking at my daughter's TikTok? That's just my opinion. May have been a bit funnier. Nonetheless, you can see that there is a clear and really quite a distinct chemistry. And I hesitate to call it chemistry. It makes it sound as though they're having an affair. What it is more so than that is it's a kind of dance. Imagine a dance where they attack each other, they bruise each other, not to a critical extent, not to a fatal degree, but just enough to wound each other and to be able to come out as more influential and more significant in conclusion. Nikki Haley also called... Nikki Haley outright called Vivek Ramaswamy scum. You're just scum in this debate. She said that. And what that will actually do is galvanise a lot of Vivek Ramaswamy's base to now gun for Nikki Haley. If I were a conspiracy theorist, I might call them in cahoots. But who knows? Who knows what goes on behind the scenes? Nonetheless, these two were absolutely the winners of this debate. Who so more, I couldn't decide. Probably Nikki Haley. She answered the questions vigorously and gave some really brutal statistics about the financial situation that the United States is in. But the same with Vivek Ramaswamy. He talked a lot about his experience as a chief executive officer and his ability to comprehend economic decisions, and particularly how that integrates with the Navy and the military. So I think they both are going to get a good, strong boost, especially when Tim Scott and Chris Christie get out of there and make way for some added undecideds. I think they're going to encounter a strong boost as a result of this debate. And with that said, let's move on to the next topic. So to start off, I'm going to be talking about the AUKUS deal, the Australian, United Kingdom and United States bilateral submarine agreement, I believe it's what its official name is, but people call it AUKUS for short. Generally, what it refers to is the deal that cut off the supply of nuclear-powered submarines from France being sent to Australia in late 2021, instead to be delivered expressly by the United Kingdom. English manufacturers would be sent to the United States. They would develop and build the submarines, and the submarines will be sent here. The pact has been quite controversial, particularly among the left in regards to the demographics that support it, because it generally is seen as a form of pandering to the United States, considering that typically Australia is seen to not get much out of it. The submarines won't or aren't expected to arrive until 2040. 2040. At the time the deal was made, that's 19 years away, 17 years now, nonetheless, still a long time. And even then, Australia is expected to foot the bill of $360 billion and also dump the nuclear waste that is produced as a result of their manufacturing. It's also noted that by the time they're implemented, those submarines are likely going to be out of date, and they're not going to work properly, or at least not be as efficient as other models that have been used in the past. But I will also speak to the people who support it, particularly the idea that there needs to be a growing sense of defense spending against players such as Russia, China, North Korea, particularly considering the following foreign policy tensions that the world is enduring now as a result of the Gaza conflict and the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So there is a growing call for these submarines to be developed and for defence spending to be increased. And it's also interesting to note that the government currently in power in Australia is a Labor or a left-wing government, one that you would expect not to support this measure. And there are members of the Labor Party of more left-wing factions than the leader who say that this undermines Australian security and the relationship between China and Australia. You may have noticed that today, Anthony Albanese is actually in Beijing to speak with Premier Xi Jinping. This was attempted as a means to reduce tariffs on Chinese goods being imported to Australia to try and reduce prices and reduce inflation. In turn, the effectiveness of this economic policy will certainly determine the route to which future governments, particularly governments who are more conservative, would like to take their relationship with China. Certainly, the reduction in tariffs is not something that the United States would generally appeal to. In fact, it in a way contradicts the AUKUS deal, considering that although it isn't necessarily said, it is generally taken as a rule of thumb that the opposing authority that the submarines are used to deal with is China. So it seems fairly hypocritical to suggest that these submarines are necessary despite the fact that the government is also trying to implement a strong relationship, or at least it seems that way to certain key demographics. So it'll be interesting to see how this deal is generally received from both the United States and Australia. The United Kingdom supports it, both parties support it. In the United States, both parties support it. However, it's interesting to note that some conservative individuals and some conservative outlets have said that it could undermine the United States' own security, as it's investing and outsourcing South Pacific security rather than sending the United States' Navy there. For example, recently a contract was given or renewed that the United States Marine Corps are allowed to enter and guard the port of Darwin in the Northern Territory in Australia. So I think that that kind of reaction is going to be interesting to measure over the next few months. There's also been finally some concerns as to whether the deal will be finalised, as to whether it will be finished or not. Because if an opposing government gets into power, or if the government loses its majority status, there is a true concern that the deal could be cancelled, much like the deal between France and Australia was. And that was a true undermining of foreign policy, as viewed by a lot of people. And France, particularly Emmanuel Macron, was not overly happy. But with that said, the AUKUS deal was not the only aspect of Australian and United States relations that was discussed at the meeting. The other, and perhaps one of the more significant ones, was Julian Assange. If you've heard about this, then you'll know that Julian Assange is a convicted whistleblower, currently in detention in the United Kingdom. He was previously an Ecuadorian citizen after quote-unquote migrating from Queensland, having been charged with releasing state secrets and exploiting them for his own gain. He's also charged with a number of other offences. He was accused of sexually harassing a girl in Sweden, though that has yet to become conclusive. Nonetheless, he's a very controversial figure. The state secrets that he released pertained to the War Powers Commission and to the actions of United States and Australian military officials in Iraq, in the Iraq War. And I think generally you'll find that people agree that there were concerning allegations made in that war, and particularly now, when foreign policy is becoming such a significant part of global politics, there's a growing movement in both nations to determine really what happened. Whether there was a breach of public conduct, whether there was a breach of trust, or whether there was outright corruption, and in the interests of one significant group, one single group, at the harm of others. So Julian Assange took out a hacking campaign to release documents that would suggest this. This was about 10 years ago. He became a notable figure, and he established the now notorious leaking website of WikiLeaks. So he's not exactly popular with renowned government officials, and particularly people who supported the Iraq War and the measures that took place within it. As such, the United Kingdom is now in the process of extraditing Mr. Assange to the United States to be prosecuted under their law. However, members of both political demographics, one such as Mr. Albanese himself, have suggested that Mr. Assange should be tried and prosecuted in Australian court, as he is an Australian, or he was an Australian citizen, and breached their law as well. Particularly, and this is ironic, you'll find that a lot of conservative outlets support freeing, pardoning, or at least sending Assange home as a means to promote the idea of whistleblowing and transparency in government. Apparently, there was an agreement of some sort made, or at least a discussion had, between Prime Minister Albanese, and President Biden as to the extent to which Assange should be prosecuted and the manner in which it should be conducted. He hasn't particularly taken out a strong stance, this is President Biden, on whistleblowing, but I do think, considering that it's largely popular, he could get around to supporting it. And I think it's especially the case considering that a known and former affiliate of Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, is in the clear and has been for some time, 10 years. And finally, we have the 2023 United States, mainly Midwest, elections. We've got results from Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, Mississippi in the gubernatorial race, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Texas. I'm going to be going through just a select few. I'm going to be going through Kentucky, Mississippi, Ohio, and Virginia. I think these are the most prudent, and I think that they are going to have a significant impact and really show a good, decent forecast for how President Biden and the 2024 presidential election is going to hold up, considering the current stature. So, let's start off with Kentucky. Andy Beshear has won re-election, and he's won big. I'm not sure where they have the exact numbers. This is the CNN coverage. Here we go. So, okay. We have Andy Beshear and Daniel Cameron. Andy Beshear won it's going to get annoying, 52.5 to 47.4. That is, I know it sounds marginal, outstanding for Kentucky, that had counties that went for 80% Donald Trump in 2016, and I believe in 2020 for some of them, to have a Democratic incumbent governor during economic turmoil in a deep red state win 52 to 47, that's outstanding, and that speaks to Beshear's popularity in that state. Now, I don't know everything about the campaign. As far as I can tell, Beshear is a moderate, but I've only heard some broad things about him, so I can't speak to that. But that does show you just how either popular Beshear is, or how significant the national swing is as a result of perhaps domestic factors, Roe v. Wade, which I'll get into in a moment, or others. So, keep an eye on Andy Beshear. He could be rising in the ranks. If he's that electorally successful, he could be rising in the ranks in a few years. Mississippi, another strong Democratic run. Although they lost, it's 51 to 47. Now again, it's marginal. But for a state that is so strong red, but for a state that is so hard red, I don't even think Republican candidates campaign there on a national stance. There's no point. Why would you? To have it become so close as to be within 4 points of each other, 4.6, that's incredible. That shows how strong a campaign Presley ran, or just how much the national mood is swinging. They don't have a map down here, but I did see a map earlier that suggested that there are a lot of western counties that were gunning for Presley and that shifted the vote significantly, so that is something to keep track of. Ohio. This wasn't a representative election so much as it was on two referendums, one enshrining the right to abortion access in the Constitution, and two, legalizing marijuana. This was interesting. Ohio's a pretty safely red state. I'd call it marginal, but these days it's more so comfortable red. So to have right to abortion go 56.6 to 43.4, that is really indicative of how big an impact Roe v. Wade has had on the national consensus. If we move it to marijuana, it's even better, 57 to 43. Democrats will enjoy that. They will see that as a positive piece of legislation. I think generally, while they don't take into account Biden's general unpopularity, they do indicate broadly where the national election is going. And I think it's going better for Democrats than people may have anticipated. Finally, I'm going to talk about Virginia and the state legislature. Everyone has predicted that Democrats will win full control of the Virginia legislature. Once again, a good result for Democrats. So, Governor Glenn Youngkin, who I've spoken about as a promising future contender for the Republican Party in the past, is not going to be happy with that. That's going to put a real wedge in his legislative agenda in the one term that he has by Constitution. I think that's really interesting, considering that he won the Virginia gubernatorial election in 2021 in an upset, and his opponent was quite popular. So I think to see this result, I think we can generally presume that this is primarily the result of the Roe v. Wade amendment. And generally speaking, it will be interesting to see how other interim elections and, of course, primary polling will be impacted by these legislative developments. It's going to be interesting to see what the Democrats do with full control of the Virginia legislature, and I also think it's going to be interesting to see how Glenn Youngkin and the Republicans react, and particularly those running for the presidency. I think it'll be interesting to see how they react. But that isn't for this video. I'd like to thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, please be sure to like and subscribe, and please join the Discord server, because I'm going to be giving you hopefully consistent updates as to what's going on and how the upload schedule is going to be over the next few weeks. So, thank you for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you and bye.